We're pleased to have with us again renowned physicist Dr. Jeremy England, who makes a connection for us between Torah and science. Dr. England is a former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, and currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Dr. England.
Thanks very much. So we have the holiday of Purim coming up, and there are a lot of different things that can and should be said about Megilat Esther, and they don't preclude or exclude each other. So everything that I say now, I don't pretend to claim that it's the only thing that Megilat Esther can or should mean, but I think it is a way of reading it that seems significant to me with respect to questions we often grapple with that really extend beyond what we usually think of as the subject matter of Megilat Esther and have more to do with general, I don't know, you might call them theological questions about how the idea of an all-powerful creator of the world is supposed to jibe with the notion that the world is governed according to knowable laws of nature that we can discern. And clearly anything that Megilat Esther, which is, as we're probably familiar, a story about court politics in the period before the Second Temple and after the First Temple, where the Jews are in exile in Persia, that's not going to be on the surface of the text. The text is not on its surface about, it's not on its surface a philosophical discourse about natural law and how that works with monotheistic theology, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't actually think it's buried so deep below the surface in another sense. And I say that because I think that one of the things we have in the story of Megilat Esther is the notion of an all-powerful king, right? The idea of a king who rules over the whole world. The text is very heavy-handed in describing at the very beginning how Achashverosh, the king of Parsu Madai, rules 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. You know, this notion of the complete extent of his rule. And he's really being held up as a emblem of total omnipotence at some level, as at least as human beings tried to construct that out of their petty politics. Now, of course, Tanakh does not consider a human being to be omnipotent, for he isn't, he's just a man. But I think that sometimes it can be argued that although someone like Achashverosh, the king of Parsu Madai in Megilat Esther, or Paro, the king of Mitzrayim, of ancient Egypt during the Exodus from Egypt, that these figures do give the text an opportunity to teach us things about what a king is, right? And that is actually important as a tool for the text in helping us to understand our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is described in our tradition as a melech, right? He's melech malchei amlachim. He's the king of kings. So if he is that, then what is a melech? What is a king? How do we understand what a king is? The whole point of that phraseology is to try to take something from our world that we're familiar with and teach us a little bit that we can understand about Hashem by analogizing some aspect of his divinity to this thing that's relatable to us. And so we take the notion of a king and we say, you know, this idea that there can be one individual who has this dominance and power over everything and that his word is law, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that is the beginning of trying to reach towards conceiving of what it is for there to be this one true king who is Hashem, right? And it's not the same thing. We're not saying Hashem is the same thing as an earthly king, but it's useful to have the idea of an earthly king in order to be able to say something about Hashem that we can start to appreciate with our limited capacity for comprehension. So insofar as that's the case, it might be that in the story of Megilat Esther, we think of Achashverosh maybe not as the villain to the same degree as Haman is, but certainly not as a positive figure in the sense that he signs his name on orders to wipe out all of the Jews. And so he has a role that is, at least at the beginning, very threatening. And we don't think of him as a hero of the story in any case. But even though we may have those negative associations with him, we still can study him and study his life and time, so to speak, the events of his court, and think to ourselves that perhaps Tanakh, which is trying to teach us many things at once, so the Hebrew Bible is trying to use the case of Achashverosh to teach us something about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and how he relates to his kingdom, right, which is the whole universe. But by letting us see analogies between the way Achashverosh rules and relates to his subjects and his courtiers, etc., and giving that as sort of an example of how an all-powerful king rules, and then taking that analogously over to our idea of a Kadosh Baruch Hu and see if we can understand something. And this is not actually such an original idea in the sense that Chazal, I know at least, so the sages of the Talmud, they accuse Paro, the king of Mitzrayim, of considering himself to be in the role of being a divine king of nature, right? They say he regarded himself as a cosmikraktor, which is actually a Greek word, but it's sort of the cosmic power, the cosmic dominator, let's say. And granted, we don't necessarily have to look at Achashverosh in the same light as Paro, but I think there is ample reason to identify the same opportunity, because this is another case where you had this pagan god king set up as a deity to rule over this enormous ancient empire. And so how he's going to rule is going to teach us things about what it is to rule with absolute power. And it may be that he's a wicked king or he's a bad king or any of those things that we might say about him. But to the degree that he is a king, we still can study his ways and maybe learn something about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ways. Because just to a certain degree, for someone to be a king, they have to act the part. And they can act the part even when they're a bad king. So that's the first idea I want to put out there, that we're going to go into Megilat Esther and try to not focus on the story exactly as a discussion of, let's say, anti-Semitism, different movements, political or otherwise, that maybe try to wipe out the Yehudim all over the world at various points in history. We're not necessarily going to talk about Nisim in this shiur, about miracles, even though Purim is a Chag where we commemorate a Nes, a miracle, and we can talk later or some other time about what that might mean. But what we want to talk about today is just the idea of kingship, dominion over everything, as a sort of talisman for what it means for Achashverosh to be this emperor, this god king, raised up above everyone else, and see if that is going to teach us something about how Tanakh, how the Hebrew Bible considers the idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in his kingship. And that's particularly interesting because we have the opportunity now to think about this as a way of discussing the question of what it means for Hashem to be the king and creator of the world, and yet for the world itself to be natural or to have laws by which it's governed. That's the thing that I really want to get into today, right? And I'll just pose, like, in one or two sentences, in a sense, what is the kind of trouble or difficulty or paradox there a little bit. So we often, in one form or another, if we think enough about what people call theology or theodicy or different kind of philosophical exercises of imagining what it is to be an omnipotent and omniscient ruler of the world or creator of the world as we conceive of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there are these problems that arise where you say, okay, the world seems to behave as though it has rules, right? It has laws and it has natural ways in which things tend to occur. And so whether we're thinking scientifically or whether we're just reasoning about the world commonsensically, it seems like there's a lot of constraint on what can happen and that things have to happen a certain way. And then at the same time, we want to have this idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the world's author and creator and king, etc., that really everything is an expression of his will and that he shouldn't be somehow constrained. So you can't say, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can have what he wants, except that he has to obey these laws of physics. He has to worry about gravity, he has to worry about this or that. That would be philosophically problematic because it sounds like there's this power that sort of chains him. And then there's a problem with our monotheism suddenly. We're sort of speaking dualistically about different powers that contend, and sometimes one gets the better of the other, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't always win. His will doesn't always triumph. So if we don't want to talk in those terms, then what does it mean that there are laws in the world? And is that something where we're going to have to reject the idea that there are laws because he has to be king? Or are we going to say he's king, but what that really means is he is like a Hashverosh, a little bit of a hapless king, chas v'chalila, that we wouldn't want to say that. So presumably that we're going to reject that option, but then the other one seems difficult, right? Because what does it mean for there to be laws if he isn't bound by the laws that he makes? So we can maybe return to that question. And now I'm going to take a big detour, because where I want to eventually get is to start talking about Achashverosh and Vashti. Achashverosh is the king, Vashti is his first queen. And so the story kicks off with this banquet that Achashverosh throws, where his queen Vashti angers him by refusing to obey his commands. So you can see how it's starting to kind of perhaps give us a hook to get at this issue a little bit, that a subject of an all-powerful king can choose to disobey. So what do we do with that? But before getting to that, I really want to build up the idea of what Vashti may represent there, allegorically, and try to find somewhat esoteric arguments in various parts of Tanakh, and also from Chazal, for supporting this idea. And I think that, in a sense, if you don't like what is about to follow in terms of trying to argue this from looking at very fine details in how certain words are used at various points in Tanakh, it may be that you can just reject all of this and still pick up with me when I start talking about Achashverosh and Vashti and just say, let's take this allegorical reading on its face and see if it's interesting. And you don't have to sort of prove that the rest of the text is encouraging you to make this reading. But first I want to try to argue to you, and maybe you'll find it implausible because it's a little too esoteric, that the text is perhaps pointing at this as an opportunity, and then we'll try to argue this out of Vashti. So one of the things that I just referred to in talking about the sort of paradox of kingship over everything, and yet also ruling over a natural world that seems to be governed by laws that we almost might worry are binding upon the king himself, is that there's a risk there of what you would call dualism, right? Meaning that there's more than one God, or at least two, right? And the question is, where is the temptation of dualism come from fundamentally? Because if you look to other ancient cultures that were grappling with understanding the world, and they were inventing forms of idolatry that in many ways led down false and crooked paths, but nonetheless were trying to capture things that they saw as being deeply true about the world, there was this great tendency to start off with something very dualistic, where creation happens as tension and conflict between different forces, or else some kind of encounter between forces that is reproductive in a sexual sense. There are all these different versions of dualism at the beginning of creation, and some more violent than others, usually pretty violent. And this is not, I'm certainly not the first person to make this observation. This is something that gets made more effectively and knowledgeably by other people who are much more familiar with a lot of different ways of looking at the world that emerged as the basis for various forms of idolatry across humankind a very long time ago. But we have to, I think, take humankind seriously, even if we would say, from the standpoint of Tanakh, from the standpoint of authority of the Hebrew prophets, we would say that those mythical idolatries were mistaken in some sense. They weren't as wrong as they could possibly be. Part of the reason they had traction is because they were trying to capture something that seemed deep about the world and what it was. So why is it that you feel this temptation to start off with two things? And I think that it comes from this idea that as soon as you have the principle for how the world is supposed to work, you also have the sort of bottom line, or the practical outcome of what happens or operates according to those principles. And there is always this kind of sense of tension in the fact that once you lay out a set of principles, you want there to be possibilities of what could happen. You want there to be different things that could occur. But if there are different things that can occur, then it seems like not everything is necessarily automatically implied by the principles. And so then people kind of struggle with this idea of, well, so is it that everything is the result of a principle and everything, there's this one found for all of being and it comes from that? Or is there sort of the software or the program, so to speak, but then there's kind of the hardware or the compiling of that program, and then there are the kind of novel possibilities that emerge, and then these things somehow can end up in tension because there's a difference perhaps between the intention of the principle and the devolution into practical consequences. So that's one thought. I don't know, you could suggest others, but the reason I give some effort to talking about that is that I think that there is a fundamental sense in which the idea of two things may be part of a true understanding of the nature of reality, not two powers that are equal, or not anything which can displace or compete with or constrain HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? The fundamental creed is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, right? That we're talking about one king and master and creator of the world. And we have to deal with that as a constraint on how Ovdei Hashem conceive of reality. Right? That's the truth that we have from our Nevi'im, from our prophets. However, it is notable now that if we go to the beginning of the Torah, that there may still be a nod at the beginning of the Torah to the idea of two, right? Not one, but two. Various things. First of all, if you know the Aleph Bet, and this maybe is the least substantive, it's interesting that the Torah chooses to start with the second letter of the Aleph Bet instead of the first, but you could get uncomfortable with that argument because exactly when the order of the Aleph Bet was determined is something we may not want to hang our hat on. However, there are other things more directly just in the text. This first famous pasuk, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, and in the beginning, we translate the word Elohim as God sometimes to the English language, but in any case, it is the one deity that who is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, created the Shamayim and the Aretz, and the heavens and the earth. And we could talk about that, but we don't even need to go further. Just look at the first two words, Bereshit bara. So first thing I noticed there is that the word bara actually appears twice, right? Beit Resh Aleph is the word bara, but also you have Beit Resh Aleph at the beginning. So this is actually kind of a sandwich where you have Beit Resh Aleph at the beginning, and then you have something in the middle, and then you have Beit Resh Aleph again. Now, what appears in the middle? What appears in the middle is Shin Yud Taf, right? So Bereshit is broken into bara, or something, some vowelization of Beit Resh Aleph, and then this word Shit, which is not the correct order of the word meaning the number two, but it is all the letters of the Torah's way of saying the number two, right? Shtei means two in many uses. Obviously, we have Shtayim also, and Shnei in various ways of saying two, but a principal way of saying two is Shtei. And it's also two feminine objects, according to the grammar of Hebrew. So that already may sound like a bridge too far because we're jumbling letters here. And I can argue that a little bit more so. I guess maybe I'll have to jump around a little bit because I'll do the sources out of order. But I will note that the word shtei is not, let's say, accidental in its association with this idea of two, because there is another aspect to the idea of two that we grapple with, whether talking about other people's ways of talking about the beginning of the world that may, as I said before, have their issues, but we're nevertheless trying to capture something that may be available to the chokhmah of humankind in understanding something about what the world is like, that there's this aspect of masculine and feminine archetypes, right? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu is described as a masculine archetype. And then there's always this question of, well, if you have a masculine archetype, but we're talking about humankind, for example, is being made b'tselem Elohim, and the Torah is even explicit about how masculine and feminine human beings were each made in the image of God, b'tselem Elohim. Then what do we do with the feminine archetype? Is that something that we need in order to fully understand the effect of the masculine archetype? Do we attribute to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Is there something that he's sort of playing off of or playing against that is feminine? And that sounds already like a very pagan question to be asking. And I think it would be very difficult to ask it if it were not the case that in our own tradition, in Tanakh, in Sefer Mishlei, for example, you have a shockingly pagan-sounding passage where Shlomo Melech, the presumptive author of Mishlei, of Proverbs, is prophetically describing wisdom, chokhmah, in a very poetic and allegorical way, and he characterizes chokhmah or wisdom as a female, as a woman, maybe sort of as more of a daughter than a wife. But I'm not going to read this whole passage. It's a very beautiful passage, like very lovely poetry in the way that it describes the creation of the world. But Chokhmah is speaking as though Chokhmah were a woman and describing herself and her role in the creation of the world and her relationship to the world's creator. And so there are, I'll read a few pieces of this so let's see, where did I want to jump in here? Bechino shamayim sham ani bechuko hug al pnei tehom be'atzmo shehakim mima'al be'azoz inoth tehom besumo leyam huko umayim lo ya'avu fiv bechuko mosdei aretz ve'ehyeh etzlo amon ve'ehyeh sha'ashuim יום יום משחקת לפניו בכל עת, משחקת בתבל ארצו ושעשועי את בני אדם. It's a very beautiful passage, very evocative. So it's talking about the creation of the world, and this female personified wisdom is saying, in the distant past, I was fashioned. At the beginning, at the origin of the earth, there was still no deep when I was brought forth. No springs rich in water before the foundations of the mountains were sunk and before the hills were born. He had not yet made earth and fields or the world's first clumps of clay. I was there when he set the heavens into place, when he fixed the horizon upon the deep, when he made the heavens above firm and the fountains of the deep gushed forth, when he assigned the sea its limits so that its waters never transgress his command, when he fixed the foundations of the earth. I was with him as a confidant, a source of delight every day, rejoicing before him at all times, rejoicing in his inhabited world, finding delight with mankind. And there are other translations of this which more so emphasize the idea that we're almost talking like about a daughter, like a girl who's playing at HaKadosh Baruch Hu's feet, so to speak. So it's shockingly pagan sounding, and both, you know, in a way that where you could say, the tradition, in fact, is very rich and expressive and embraces different ways of talking. And within the authority of the tradition, sometimes we need these ways of talking. And because the tradition has the authority to talk this way, then we can, but we don't want to sort of deviate beyond the bounds of what it authorizes. And much in the same way that if the Torah commands us to make golden molten statues that we put on top of the holy ark that's in the Holy of Holies in the Mishkan, then maybe that's allowed, but you're not supposed to do that creatively for your other ideas about how to worship, right? So there are instances where maybe this is okay only because it's written here. And this might be one of them. And also, I think you have to say that Shlomo Melech is not a randomly chosen personality to be saying these things. He also famously ended his career in degradation, interestingly, because of his dalliances with many women who worshipped foreign idols and led him into idolatry. So that kind of completes the warning sign that we place around this way of conceiving of talking about the beginning of the world. And nonetheless, the words of Tanakh here are part of the truth that we're invited to study and learn from and understand. And so it's not actually, I think, a totally foreign idea to be tempted to talk about nature, right? Chokhmah, nature, the wisdom to understand what the world is and how it works, as a feminine personality. Why is that temptation so strong? I mean, where does that come from? I would like to do at some point a whole other shiur about that, because I think there's a whole other question of wisdom as an object of worship, and the temptation to make an idol out of wisdom, and the dangers of that, and what the texts of our tradition have to say about where those dangers are most powerfully felt and how to avoid them. But if we leave that aside for now, I think what we at least can say is that it is a almost universal human desire to personify the world as a woman, and to personify nature as a woman. And we could psychoanalyze that or analyze it in various other ways. But I think we should take it as a fact that there are things about nature that are compellingly feminine, and that it becomes part of the imaginary space of the human mind to seek to describe the universe or nature as a whole, with its various dimensions that seem feminine, such as its incredible productivity or ability to create and give birth to things, just as one example. That temptation is very strong, and it at some level it becomes part of the wisdom of trying to speak of the world allegorically. So let's carry that idea forward, that we can accept the idea that, at least allegorically speaking, thinking of nature as a feminine personality is something perhaps that is accurate within the framework of allegorical speaking that Shlomo Melech is teaching us here, even if it contains its dangers. Now, I will add and comment that this passage from Mishle is part of an elaborate and lengthy passage where there's a discussion of a woman who seemingly has kind of a blurred identity, because sometimes she's being talked about as chokhmah, as wisdom, and is being described in a positive light. But then there's also aspects of this same personality that suddenly are being described as a zonah, as a prostitute, and as like a foreign source of temptation and a temptation into sin. And so that is a whole long discussion. But there's another quotation essentially from the same passage that actually comes a bit earlier. And I note it here because a favorite set of three letters from earlier in our discussion appears. Vehine isha likrato shit zona unsurat lev. So the word shin yud taf is appearing, this particle that we chopped off of, that we realized there were two baraz here, and then something that was the letters that could make the word two. If you rearrange them just a little bit, they also mean a word, which means a garment, and that appears here, not many places in Tanakh, but appears here in the same passage in Proverbs that's describing a woman who is being likened to wisdom, and sometimes positively and sometimes like a zonah. And so that is an interesting thing to note if we're accumulating our bits of esoteric evidence. And I also just want to point out another passage where the same word appears, this word Shin Yud Taf, which is the end of the word Bereshith. And it again is meaning some kind of garment, that it's a fabric, right? So the main point here now is that it's being, if we're actually talking about what it means, it's a fabric. We should think of a sort of a woven garment of some kind. And a last bit of evidence just about this opening discussion of this word. I don't know if I would say it's the last bit, but it closes one part of the idea, is that another thing that if you start to look just based on this set of ideas at uses of the word shtei, just to mean two, through the entire book of Bereshit, Sefer Bereshit, the book of Genesis, I may have had a faulty computer algorithm that wasn't giving me every case, but certainly the majority of cases, because everyone that I could find had this property, every single one of them is being used to describe two women, right? So shtei nashim shem ha'echad ada v'shem ha'shenit tzila, that's the first one. So two women who were the wives of Lamech. But it just keeps on going. It's someone's daughters, Lot's daughters. There are two of them. There's two sisters who are the daughters of Lavan, Rachel and Leah Imenu. There's their two shivchot, or shivchot, their handmaidens. So there are two of them, Bila and Zilpa. And so every time the word shtei appears, it's always talking about two daughters, two wives, two women of some kind. So the number two, and this word shtei specifically meaning the number two, and the idea of women is totally wrapped up together in all of Sefer Bereshit. So another little piece of esoteric evidence. What we're trying to build up is this idea that at the beginning of Sefer Bereshit, we're hiding the idea of two, and we're also hiding the idea of a feminine aspect. And this is, in a sense, perhaps what Shlomo Melech is picking up on and expounding upon in Sefer Mishle, very dangerously, because it's obviously an extremely problematic idea at the beginning of Sefer Bereshit to play around with this concept too lightly, since we're not intending to divide HaKadosh Baruch Hu into two, and that's where we're going to land with Megilat Esther, is why that doesn't work and how the text kind of tries to resolve it. One last rapid accumulation of other bits of possibly not convincing esoteric evidence is the word shti, which is not the same thing as shtei. Shtei is two. The word shti, which is another way of using shin, taf, and yud, also means something about garments. So we had the word sheath, which is shin yud taf, and that is referring to a garment, a woven fabric of some kind. And then the word shti, which is probably not too unrelated, in the language of the Torah, refers to what's called the warp of a fabric. So there's the warp and the woof or weft of woven fabric. In English, we have these like Old English words to describe this stuff. But in Hebrew, it's shti and erev. And then you have other terms associated with weaving. It's maybe the sort of funniest and perhaps least substantive point that you can make along these lines. So there's a source here in the Gemara where we have the word for the shuttle, which is kind of like I believe the big sort of wooden needle that you use to throw back and forth while you're weaving. And the word for that is buchiar. So the reason I think that's interesting is because we have over and over and over again in the work of creation, vayehi erev, vayehi boker, right? We have, and it was evening and it was morning, but since erev also means the idea of the woof of a woven fabric, we have this word shti that is referring to the warp, and shti is appearing right in the middle of creation, and then buchiar is like boker, right? So it's all of these puns and plays and words that are connecting this idea of two and a woman and weaving of fabric, and they're all kind of rolled together into this very tight bundle of different connotations that are hard to separate. So this is too many things to hold in one's working memory at once, but we're talking about creation as we're looking for a feminine personality as we conceive of the idea of a king and creator who's trying to create the world and sort of put it together, right? The idea of weaving is sort of the idea of the order of nature, putting the order of nature together. And so we have in just the first opening passages of Sefer Bereshit describing the creation of the world, all of these puns or references that broadcast out into other parts of Tanakh that have threads, so to speak, that are connected, having to do with femininity, having to do with the idea of two, having to do with the idea of weaving, having to do with the idea of a woven tapestry or a garment that is composed of woven threads. So why is all of that interesting? Why do we want to take that now into Megilat Esther? What does this have to do with Megilat Esther? Well, of course, what I want to take note of is the fact that the first queen of Achashverosh is named Vashti, right? And Vashti is, if you want, just a Persian queen whose name happens to be Vashti, and everything that I just said can be uninteresting, and we can still pick up now and start talking about things allegorically, and you can just see if that's an interesting discussion. But all that I wanted to do by pulling everything together that I just described is to say that I notice in the name Vashti that it's also a name that contains the word shti, and so we have two and femininity and the idea of weaving from this word shti that has to do with the warp of the woven linen. So and these threads that trace back to the idea of creation and doubling and the number 2 at the beginning of creation. And so it's not, if you buy all of those different connotations, so accidental that we should think, oh, so maybe we should be looking at this allegorically, because not only do we have Achashverosh, this very great cosmic actor, nature or cosmos dominator type king, who is in charge of everything in the story, in the construct of the story, but we also have a feminine part being played here by someone whose name is just this very rich point of intersection of many of these different connotations involving creation, involving weaving, involving femininity, involving the idea of a counterpart, a feminine counterpart, like wisdom, like chokhmah, who's playing at Hashem's feet, so to speak, when he created the world in the language of Shlomo HaMelech. So that's where we want to kick this off. And then actually what we have to say about Megilat Esther itself can be, in a sense, very brief, because now I think the allegorical considerations are fairly straightforward at some level, and we can have a bit of a discussion about it. But the main point I want to make is that what happens in the narrative now, Vashti is this queen who now represents to us the idea of nature as this woven fabric. And what happens? Achashverosh says that she should come, and before everyone, there's a whole list of all these servants of his, and he wants all of his servants, all of his courtiers at his banquet to see her beauty displayed. And Chazal add to that she was really being expected to come naked, in a sense. So it's about the idea of revealing all the secrets of how nature is knitted together and woven together, right? And that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if he is the king, he should be able to have happen whatever he wishes, right? But what the narrative is showing us is that if we try to understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a king whose queen is nature, right, and that she is this woven perfection of nature that has all of these detailed rules of exactly how everything has been pieced together, that if we conceive it that way, of things that way, it will be a failure as a marriage, so to speak. It's showing us that kind of philosophical approach to the idea of Hashem as creator doesn't work. And why doesn't it work? It doesn't work because Achashverosh is the absolute king and he's supposed to be obeyed, right? But once you personify all of nature as this alternative person or individual who has their own choices to make, their own way of working, then she can refuse his command, right? The king can say, you must come and put on for display all the rules of how you work, so to speak. So it's the idea of, let's say, in the philosophical idea of a Hellenic natural philosopher or scientist today, that like one day perhaps we'll understand all the laws of nature and it will all be laid bare and we'll see how it all fits together and we'll know what everything is, and then we'll have the explanation for everything. That if you conceive of that goal as a separate person, that separate person cannot also at the same time be completely subordinate to the king, because you have conceived of the universe as a whole as being part of that woven fabric. And so if you try to create such a person in your mind, you try to create such an ideal of the totalizing extent of Chokhmah in your mind, then you will eventually get to the point where you have demoted the king from total power over everything because you've conceived of the universe as being something that, in a sense, could override or disobey him. And so now, carrying the story forward, Ahasuerus has to get rid of this wife, right? That doesn't work. That doesn't make sense. That isn't a relationship that succeeds as an allegorical description of Hakadosh Baruch Hu's relationship, if he's, so to speak, in a marriage, right? We see it fall apart before our eyes because of the contradiction that inheres in the idea that he can command this feminine personality and she can choose to disobey and choose to rebel. Because if that's what nature is, then the idea that nature could say no to Hashem means that Hashem is not the true king and creator of the world. So there are a few other things I want to maybe skip over and come back to. Well, just mainly this point, the source about Mordechai. I think we can return to it in due course. But let's talk about the sort of evangelical aftermath of all of this, all the events that take place subsequently. So whom does Ahasuerus marry next? He marries Esther. And Esther, her name actually contains a different idea, right? Because the word asater, for example, which is used first in Hakadosh Baruch Hu's dialogue and discussion with Cain. It's actually in the words of Cain. He's saying, your face will be hidden from me. Seter is hiding, right? Hester panim is when Hakadosh Baruch Hu hides his face. So Esther's name now contains the idea of something remaining hidden, as opposed to Vashti, who is being asked to appear naked, right? To come and display her glory before everyone. So Esther, there's some notion of something in how the world works remaining not known to us or knowable to us. So that seems like we're getting off to a better start in terms of that, so to speak, making a successful marriage. But then on top of that, Esther is Yehudiya. She is a Jewess. She is from the nation of Israel. And so that is giving us a figuration of a marriage for HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's very different, because now if he's married to anyone, he's not married to nature as a whole. He's married to Am Yisrael. He's married to, conceived of as a bride for him, which is something we have from the language of many of our Nevi'im. Sometimes when they're criticizing, right, because they describe Am Yisrael as an adulteress who has turned away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu towards idols in an adulterous fashion. But the point is that notion of HaKadosh Baruch Hu being married to Am Yisrael as a bride is something we have a lot of support for throughout our tradition and the language of the Nevi'im, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. So we should maybe be more comfortable with that, but we still should be interested, allegorically speaking, what now is the rest of the narrative telling us about, why that is more successful somehow and how it works exactly. And so in order to understand this last bit, we need the idea of Haman. So Haman is the enemy, of course, the bad guy in the story, the antagonist. He is this individual that eventually Ahasuerus raises him above all his other servants. So we have this idea of Ahasuerus as a king that gives commands to his different servants and they're expected to obey, but now he's trying to raise Haman above all his other servants. And so in a sense, it's almost kind of like a reprisal of this notion of, can we still create some sort of situation where everything in creation is ruled under some law that is subordinate to the idea of the king being creator, that there's some servant of the king that has the whole portfolio. And Vashti maybe lost the portfolio because she didn't make sense and was rejected and kicked out of the story. But now Haman is demonstrating this tendency to keep on trying to recollect back together the idea that there must be something that is determining the outcome, right? Like we need the idea of laws of nature. We need the idea of the world working a certain way because there is a chokhmah to how it works, and we observe it to have all this predictability and all this sense by which it operates. So could Haman stand for that? And what's interesting is that possibly because of this new marriage, right? To us, to Esther, whose name contains the idea of hester, right? Of hiding, of something remaining hidden. We need now for nature to be governed by something that isn't totally knowable, and yet still perhaps could be the law by which nature operates. So isn't it interesting that Haman is all about randomness, right? Or I know I'll say the opposite in another shiur that's coming up, because I think that you can read Haman different ways. But for our purposes here, the name of the Chag is Purim, and a Pur is a lot that was cast by Haman. And we usually think of a lot as standing for the idea of random chance, right? You sort of throw a stick on the ground, you spin a top, you roll a die, whatever it is that you're doing. You're casting something down on the ground that seems fundamentally unpredictable to you, so that it can produce an outcome that comes from somewhere, that ascends to the highest decisor, right? Because at some level, what caused the die to fall this way versus that way, or the coin toss, or whatever lot you're casting, that must be, all of the things that we can't predict must be coming from some authority that rules the world by deciding the outcomes of all the chance occurrences. So Haman is starting to represent the idea that, okay, maybe the world doesn't entirely behave in this predictable way, in like a classical naturalistic idea of law-likeness and determinism, where you can see every thread in the tapestry, so to speak, and how it all fits together. But maybe we just take all the things that are hidden and we don't understand, and we say, okay, well, there are random things. There are the chance occurrences. And interestingly, that even still captures some of the same idea of, when we went back to other reasons why we need the notion of the feminine at the beginning of creation. It's because the idea of two is also about choice, right? It's about the idea of dividing paths, right? That there are two different ways that things could go. And that's obviously a very feminine idea, because 2 makes 4 and 4 makes 8 and 8 makes 16, right? So you have this idea of a branching tree of possibility, and the reproductiveness of that exponential growth is, in one sense, a feminine idea. And this is even captured, I wanted to put this source in, but I forgot, by a pasuk in Sefer Yechezkel, which describes the king of Bavel, Melech Bavel, who's trying to decide which way to go at a crossroads. There's a fork in the road, and he's planning his conquest, and he's trying to use augury to, magic, to ksamim, to decide which way to go. And the fork in the road is described as Em Haderech, right? The word in biblical Hebrew, and carried over into poetic modern Hebrew, for a crossroads or a fork in the road is Em Haderech, and Em means mother, right? So it's another idea of feminine reproductivity at the moment of a choice between two different ways that things could go. So even this idea of Haman as being all about casting the lot, the goral, and the choice between different possibilities, or amongst different possibilities, Haman really still stands for some of that same, let's say, need for a feminine concept in the notion of creation as an unfolding tapestry of possibilities. But we're still going to have a problem with Haman. So what's the problem with Haman? The problem with Haman is that if there are occurrences in nature that are truly random, right? That all the things that we can't use our wisdom to fully uncover and examine and determine, that if the remainder of what determines the outcome is actually unpredictable and random and just due to chance, then that still is kind of a problem with dualism, right? Because you're saying that, well, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can have his way, except for the fact that there's this sort of demon tossing coins and coming up with heads and tails and throwing chaos and randomness into the mix. And sometimes you can just flip heads 12 times in a row, and that can be a big problem, because it eventually will lead to the destruction, for example, of Am Yisrael. The idea of Am Yisrael as an eternal people, as the people that will never be destroyed, because our brit, our covenant with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is written into the fabric of the universe, and that he will never fully abandon us. That doesn't work with pure randomness, because pure randomness gets you, the average a typical amount of times, and gets you small deviations from the average a certain amount of time, but it can get you arbitrary deviations from the average some of the time. And if you're talking about eternity, that's a long time. So thinking now in kind of the mindset of a statistical physicist, for the same reason that something that is made of a finite set of constituent parts that are subject to random forces, if you make a model of the thing you're conceiving of and you imagine all the pieces of it are each subject to a quasi-independent coin toss, if you want to flip heads a billion times in a row, you just have to wait long enough. So if you're tracking the success of the eternal relationship that Am Yisrael has with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then over eternity, eventually you, so to speak, get your rare event, your spontaneous combustion, whatever you want to call it. And there's no more Am Yisrael. We just, we were dealt the worst hand possible in a billion years, and it's over. And the promise was not fulfilled, and we didn't make it, right? That is a philosophical possibility the moment you introduce the idea that some things are up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and some things are up to chance. And so Haman is also rejected. This idea that Ahasuerus as king is going to consolidate responsibility for his empire under this servant, and the whole portfolio goes to this one servant who throws lots and is someone who injects randomness. That's not a solution to the problem either. You can't really solve the problem by saying some things are left to chance. And that could be the beginning of a much longer discussion, because I think it would be great to do another shiur about Nisim, about the idea of miracles, why we celebrate Purim as a chag that has to do with a nes, with a sort of either an unnatural or an improbable occurrence that needs to be commemorated. And so improbability is something we can come back to and have a longer discussion about. But the point is, in the end, the way the story works in this allegorical reading is fundamentally HaKadosh Baruch Hu is married to and loyal to his wife, Esther. And when she comes to him and says, look, Haman is going to kill my people, the way that it ends is with Haman on the gallows. So you have narratively this brilliant idea that there is a way in which the world seems to operate according to chance, but that when those chances fundamentally convene to seek to destroy Am Yisrael for eternity, to cancel or nullify his brit, his promise with Bnei Israel to keep us as his people forever, then Haman goes to the gallows and Esther and Mordechai win the day. And just a last brief comment about this idea. I like also, as a sort of a sideshow to this, that there's this shorter story with with Mordechai and Haman, where Mordechai starts by foiling a plot to kill the king before Haman comes to power, and his loyalty to the king is recorded. So Mordechai, as a Yehudi, as a Jew, shows his loyalty to the king, right? And that show of loyalty is ultimately rewarded with what? With Haman parading Mordechai around the city, saying, this is a man that the king wishes to give honor to and to glorify. So in this little vignette, what it additionally gives us alongside this other allegory is the idea that the loyalty of Am Yisrael to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in turn gives us this zchut, this merit, that we can feel ourselves to be succeeding by our own strength, so to speak. That Mordechai is ultimately glorified and upheld and feeling like he's the hero of the story, but it's Haman who represents this idea of chance occurrence that is having to parade him around the city, meaning that whatever we do, to succeed, we deserve perhaps some congratulation for that, but it ultimately comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? It comes from his choice to let us succeed and to not dash us on the rocks with chance occurrences that went the other way. And so we always have to give due credit to Hashem for any of our successes, because he sort of helped us to have enough of the heads turn up as heads instead of tails in order for things to work out in the way that we wanted. So Mordechai is being shown in this example as a Yehudi whose loyalty to the king, right? Whose loyalty, so to speak, allegorically to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, earns him the merit ultimately of seeing the fruits of his efforts as success, but only because the deck had to be stacked in his favor, because Haman is the one who's being tasked with parading him around, and so he represents the idea of chance going in our favor instead of against us. And at that moment, by the way, Haman is still set on destroying the Yehudim. That hasn't been resolved yet at that moment when Mordechai is feeling like he's the hero of the story. So I'll close just by saying that all of this, I think, is being referenced by Chazal in this passage. It is a comment by Chazal, by the sages of the Talmud, on this passage about Chokhmah, about wisdom, that's in Mishlei, where it refers to Esther and talks about her preparing this banquet for Mordechai and Haman, sorry, for Achashverosh and Haman. And then the only thing I want to pull out of this, because it's a long and fascinating passage, but it is interesting that it pulls together a few different things here, because it's connecting Purim to this passage in Mishlei. But the only thing I want to pull out is an idea I already obliquely was referring to, which maybe if I click here, I can emphasize here in this region here. So there are two holidays that will never be canceled, no matter when in the future, according to our sages. And one of them is Purim, and the other one is Yom HaKippurim. And of course, there's a pun there, right? HaKippurim sounds like it's like Purim, and that's something I believe that's picked up on in later drashot that maybe are Kabbalistic. But this is from an authentic source that goes back to Chazal, that's essentially making this point more obliquely. So why is this true? Why is it that Purim and Yom HaKippurim are the two Hagim that will never be canceled? Well, they're about the same thing in a variety of ways. For example, they both involve fasting, either narratively or halachically. But I think that the fundamental point is this. Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonement, is really a celebratory day. Why? Because it's a Yom Rina, it's a day of song according to Chazal. Why? Because it's the day that we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for promising to never destroy us, despite the fact that we sort of deserve it, right? That we commit sins, we fail, we do not succeed in being the people that he has charged us with being according to the Torah. And by rights, he should wipe us out, but he doesn't, and he never will because he promised not to. And so we are saved from total destruction every year, so to speak, and we need to ritually acknowledge our gratitude for being saved and being forgiven, despite the fact that we are sort of in violation, perpetual violation of the contract. Purim is a narrative instance of that salvation, right? It's about the fact that you cannot annihilate Am Yisrael completely because of the promise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so, you know, the world being what it is, it seems natural, it seems partly random. You can come close, or you can have horrible things that happen, whether in the time of the Romans or the time of the Inquisition or the time of Hitler or whenever. So it's not a full protection from anything that is frightening or painful or disastrous. But at the end of the day, if we're talking about total annihilation of Am Yisrael, the deck is always stacked to prevent this. And this is the promise, the promise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, for which we thank him on Yom HaKippurim, is being laid out before us in this reading of Purim, that I think Chazal maybe are getting at a bit here in this passage. So with that, I'll finish, and we can have a bit of time for discussion.
Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Oh, thank you.
Yes. Chaim, you wanted to say something? Oh, okay. Just something I was thinking about in the first part of the shiur regarding the word sheet or sheath, that it similar to the word sheet in English, and very often we found the Rab Bar-Hayim has spoken about this, even devoted perhaps a few videos to the topic of the connection, the roots you can find, Hebrew roots you can find in English. So I thought that was an interesting.
Yeah, I feel less knowledgeable and skilled whether in enough ancient Hebrew or in linguistics or any other necessary components of that to comment on this particular example, whether I think there's how you distinguish between what you would call a coincidence and what you would call a bona fide resemblance. But it is a resemblance, I agree. I mean, I think you might come up with a colloquial translation of the word Shin Yud Taf into English as it's being used in some of these sources in Tanakh as just the word sheet in English.
So I found it, your shiur, very fascinating. I'm wondering if I think I'm going to listen again to really absorb it on a deeper level. But one way of summing up what you were saying, perhaps, is that there are focal points for looking at the world, perhaps. One focal point is, I understand this is only one take on your shiur, that one focal point being divine natural law as being the way the world runs. Another focal point is seeing randomness in it. And then the other focal point is seeing the Hashgacha Pratit, the divine providence. Is that one way? Would you say that's one way of conveying what you said?
Yeah, I think so. I think that what I see the Megillah grappling with when read at this level is the question of how you deal with the idea simultaneously that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has unfettered ability to express his will in determining the outcome of events in the world, and at the same time that he has the desire for the world to have a regularity and order to it that reflects a set of standing decrees about how it's supposed to operate. And actually, that's a point I failed to mention, probably because I forgot to put in the source, but I wanted to, which is that another aspect of how this works is that if you look narratively at what happens after Haman is hanged, where Esther also wants to save her people, and the king says he cannot revoke his decree to destroy the Yehudim, that he sent out the orders and he doesn't cancel orders once he sent them out. That is a mind-boggling kind of problem in the narrative when you read it, especially as a child, where you just say, wait, but he's the king. Why can't he just say, no, I changed my mind. This is the new order. Why is he acting this way? Where he says, no, you have to go defend yourself. So I can make another decree that you should go and fight as well, but I'm not going to rescind my decree and call my own word null and void. So one of the things I think that we're being taught there is, it gets back to the beginning of the shiur, this idea of you learn from the text what it is to be a real king, right? That real kings are actually, they choose, in order for their word to carry weight, they choose to act with respect to their own word a certain way. So he as a king could choose to act with frivolity about his own word and constantly change his own orders. And if he did, then his word would be a less hefty thing, and the world would have less stability. If we now think in terms of HaKadosh Baruch Hu acting this way, right? That his standing decrees, if he's constantly canceling them and changing them, there would be no stable order on the basis of which everything else could happen. And so instead, what's being portrayed is the idea that he makes decrees and he has servants, so to speak. He has forces or powers or processes or however you want to conceive of them that are in operation. But he also at another level is kind of holding all the cards and can set different things in motion to balance each other out. And it's a little bit confusing because I think we have to kind of both conceive of Achashverosh as representing the idea of kingship in the narrative, and we also have to step out of the narrative and say everything in the narrative is really subject to the true ruler and king and creator. And so what that means is that the story, in a sense, can't turn out the wrong way. And there's another level of control, which maybe is connected with this idea of the Kedusha of the holiness of Hashem is such that when we try to make an allegory, there's always an element that's missing of him that's outside the story. And so, you know, we have that as well. But I do see in what you were describing, the tension amongst those different things, like hashgacha pratit, you know, divine providence on the one hand, and the idea of chance occurrence and the idea of natural law, that part of how this is resolved is that we see the idea that the kingship of Hashem should make him, if he wants to be a king whose word carries real weight, it should make him desire for problems not to be resolved by canceling his word, but rather by making other decrees that come into contradiction with or produce some kind of fair fight between different forces that he sets in motion. And so it perhaps is a nod in the direction of the idea that, yes, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can make miracles, so to speak. He can bring about events that are highly unlikely, but he's going to choose to do that in a way that leaves the fabric of naturalism as fully woven as possible while it's happening, that he doesn't tear everything up and start over every time he wants something to happen his way, that he has the kind of deftness to do it as part of the system as opposed to a violation of the system.
I also I would also interest another interesting point, which is that regarding those 3 points of divine providence or natural law or randomness, I'm just thinking out loud right now that hashgacha pratit, divine providence, well, in other words, there's tension between these 3 concepts, and I think that even among the Rishonim, great scholars over the generations, there's different understandings about how these 3 focal points are balanced between each other. For example, what exactly does come within the framework of divine providence, or what might indeed be left to some degree of randomness. Yeah, there's some question marks here. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I agree that it's not a set of contradictions that you're supposed to walk away from feeling like you've resolved it all and now we can stop losing sleep over it. It's a very challenging subject, but I think part of also what the Megilat is getting at is that we make it a challenging subject for ourselves by posing the problem to ourselves in a certain way, that we try philosophically to conceive of these problems, and we're actually already thinking by analogy. And so if you're going to think by analogy, then you can explore this narratively in an allegory, and you can find that it's very subtle indeed in terms of how different elements of the argument play against each other. And I would say that in general, our tradition is most brilliant and unique and authentic and distinctive when it avoids the philosophical argument in favor of the narrative that comprehends and embraces all the different possible philosophical arguments and weighs them against each other and interwoven with each other, such that you can find them there if that's what you're looking for. But at another level, the truth is partly in the fact that the whole discussion has to be represented as a narrative bundle of contradictions.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. England.
My pleasure, as always.
Always our pleasure for you to be with us.
Take care.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.